Welcome to Next Round with me, Dale McDermott.
And me, David W. Higgins.
A young Irish look at the economy, politics and society.
Covering home and abroad.
For the thinkers, the dreamers and the doers, this is Next Round. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Next Round. On today's episode, we want to start off with housing, and there has been some mixed messaging and lots of data that's been released in recent weeks with respect to housing commencements being up, completions being down, also numbers on mortgage drawdowns as well. So it's been a bit of a mixed bag, and we want to spend some time analysing that. We're also just over a week into the second presidency of Donald Trump, and tariffs are very much on the agenda. We are filming this and recording this on Friday, and tariffs of 25% are at least meant to be enacted on Canada and Mexico, the nearest neighbours of the US, tomorrow. So tariffs are very much front and centre of mind. So with that, we want to talk about tariffs and what effect that might have for the future, and in particular Ireland, given how open we are from an economic perspective. And then lastly, there has been a vibe shift online, and with social media companies such as Meta now taking a different approach to how they regulate and look at online presence, with fact checking going towards the back of the room, and front and center come things like community notes. We want to talk about what that means as well. So if you do like this podcast, please please share, and please subscribe to us. We are available on all major podcasting platforms. Also available to watch on YouTube, where you can look at our YouTube channel and see us there, and also subscribe. David, it is good to see you.
See you too, Dale. How are you keeping well?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been a busy couple of weeks, and I know today we have a lot we want to talk through, and I think housing is where we want to go to first of all. And as I mentioned in the opening point there, that there's been a bit of a mixed bag with respect to the data points on housing. We have seen commencements at least being reported as significantly up, but completions down in the end on last year, and also then some data that's been released on mortgage drawdowns as well. So let's start there. What's the take on it?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the number that really gripped the headlines, which was the completion number. So commencements is where you put your boots on the ground, your shovel in the ground as well, and you start building. But completing it is when you hook it up to the ESB network, and it's really livable, and that's when people can benefit from it. But the number for 24 was down on 23. It was down 6.7%. So in 2023, we built 32,500 homes, but we built just over 30,000 in 24. But what's interesting in the mix there is that they split the data between single, which is just one-off housing, scheme, which will be your 3-bed semi-estates and the rest, and then apartments. So the apartments number was down a lot. It was down nearly 3,000, down 24%. So only 8,500 built, but prior year we did 11,500. Scheme then was actually up. So we're actually building more of 3-bed semi-estates. That's up 4.6%. We built 16,000 of those, and that's almost half of the total. And then your one-off houses, about 5,000, and that was down slightly by 2.2%. So on that data set alone, the headline is worrying, but the underlying mix is it's a better mix than what could have been. I mean, if you had apartments being way up, but 3-bed semis being down, that would have been more challenging, because you would have had more rental stock but not more stock to buy, and that's crucial for getting people into home ownership, is actually more homes available to buy.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm looking at the figures here as well, I mean, 22, we saw a significant increase on certainly on apartments being built. It went from 5,000 in 21 to 9,000 in 22. And then last year in 23 jumped up to 12,000. Then again last year, just gone back down to 9,000. So is there any sort of theory or reason as to why this downward trend, or why we couldn't keep the pace up? Because the government keeps talking about, we're on the right track, it's momentum, the volume is being kept up, but the data says that's not the case.
Yeah, so the government's target of 40,000 for 2024 was was quite strongly missed. And I'm a little bit questioning now, well, who came up with that number, and was it was it for the sake of targeting a nice round number like 40? I don't know.
Also, 60,000 is the number which has come into people's radar. I know Fianna Fáil have that as their ambition now, to have 60,000 new homes built every year. We're way off that.
Yeah, and we're going to have to get to that pace if you want to build like 250, 300,000 homes over the course of this stalled term. You're going to need, on average, 50 a year. But where you're at 30 now, you're going to need to get to 40 and then 50. But then you're also going to need to get 60 or 70 in the later half of the dull term. So it's going to be really, really challenging. But just to go back on the question of, well, why has this dip emerged?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's been such great effort behind housing and making sure that the kind of the legal environment's right, planning environment right, making sure the funding is there, all of that. You got to go back 2 years ago, because stuff that you start to build 2 years ago only gets completed today. When we hit 2022, the year 22, that was when inflation had spiked and when interest rate expectations really, really rose. So where there were kind of, I have a number here, it shows about 35,000 commencements in the year to early 2022. It's kind of March of 22. By the time you fast forward, then not to the end of 22, but to the end of 23, there had been a dip, right? So the 35,000 number dipped to around 27,000,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually a 30% fall. So there was a real cautionary moment throughout 2022 where people said, I'm not so sure if we should be starting building here. But it was only by the end of 23, nearly 2 years later, that we got back to that 35 or so thousand level. And we have continued quite strongly since. But that dip, it tells me that the completion numbers that we're going to see throughout 2025 may continue to disappoint, maybe a bit below, again, what we had in the prior year in 24, and that we come be below this year. And that really it may only be from 26 onwards that we see a real pickup in supply once more.
Well, there was a report released by Mitchell McDermott, which is a construction consultancy, and it said that the government data on construction activity, they said, had presented a quote false narrative, or a misleading narrative, with respect to housing output. So, the Department for Housing earlier on this year said that developers had started building 60,000 homes, which was an 84% increase compared to 2023. And the belief here actually is that there was a surge linked to this because developers were seeking to avail of the various development levy waivers and water connection charge refunds, which were applicable in 2024. So effectively, you saw this big rush trying to get in commencement orders and notices before those grant eligibility timelines were actually going to be invalid.
Yeah, so this presents a further challenge. So if you get commencements going, that may be as simple as setting up a site and having a foundation built, or even steps before that. It doesn't mean that within 2 years' time, you're then going to realize that same number of completions. It may be in
Sure.
3 or 4 years' time. And why is that? Well, if you're a building company and your capacity is only to build a couple of hundred or 1,000 homes a year, and you see that levy opportunity and you say, well, let's get 2,000 of those commencements done, but you can only build 1,000 at a time. But that means that you're going to have your builders working on your other sites in the meantime. You'll leave that other site kind of just sitting there for a time, but with the foundation built or whatever bits that kind of meet the threshold of a commencement. And then in a couple of years' time, like, you're not going to not build on it because you've gone through the cost of getting the commencement, it is proof that there is that demand, that kind of willingness to go and build that supply. But there could be even a further delay down the line in actually completing that. So maybe some of these units will take like 3 or 4 years to finish.
But isn't that the point as well? Is that, you know, the real question here is not just you know, the economics to support the demand for housing, but also the fact that in terms of capacity, are the people there needed to actually build the homes that clearly the pipeline is needed to supply?
Yeah, so this is where it might be worth looking at construction sector employment, because that's really a key gauge, I think, of whether we can build enough homes. So if you go back to the 2000s, I think the history on this is worthwhile. Like, we used to have probably less than 100,000 construction workers back in the 90s, and we surged over 150,000 by 2003, and then we peaked in 2006 with nearly 250,000 people working in construction, and that as a share of total employment was bananas. It was kind of like twice what the sector used to be. And then we had this.
Now the country was
crash.
playing catch up. Like, I think the country was playing catch up though, right? In terms of its quality of homes, population also increased significantly.
Fair, yeah. Like, we were doing things like building motorways, and that was in there too, and that, you know, is very much a legacy that we're happy with. And all the homes that we built are now being lived in too, so that's something worthwhile as well. But I guess, okay, so employment continues to tick up during 2012, 13, 14, all the way through to 20, dip through COVID. But in the years 22, 3, and 4, the increase in construction employment has been more gradual. So it hasn't been the same upward tilt in the line. And we're somewhere just under 200,000 now, people working in the construction sector. But if we had kept the pace in the pre-COVID years, we could well be up to that 250,000 place today, but we're not. So what that tells me is that even though we have more construction workers than we ever have had since the boom, we still may not have enough to be delivering a very strong pipeline through. Because really construction is a measure of people who are actually going off and working on the stuff. Just because you have commencements, as I explained, doesn't mean that you actually have people at that site working away on it. They might be on other sites, and then they'll move to that site when the time is ready and the capacity is there. So that may well be a further hindrance to supply coming through over the next while.
Speaking of the, I think the mix of planning permission is also pretty interesting as well. So, you know, if you look back in 2016, there was about 16,000 housing permissions in that year. 12,000 of those were for houses, and just 4,000 were actually for apartments. So, significant majority on your traditional house. If you go to, let's say, 2021, it was 17,000 applications for homes and 26,000 for apartments. So it even crossed the majority of housing types. But then if you go back to this year again, you've seen the balance change again, where it's 21,000 housing applications. Sorry, in last year in 2024, compared to 14,000 in apartments. So we saw this huge demand, mostly during the COVID years, actually, appear for apartments, and that seems to be, tapering off now.
Yeah. Like, the thing about when interest rates went up back in 22, which type of house was more likely to be impacted? It's way more likely to hit apartments. And I'll just explain why. If you're building a house, if you're someone like Cairn Homes or Glen Bay, and you build estates of 3-bed semis, after you go through the first 2 years of doing that, you start to get money in the door. You start to sell those homes, and you're getting more than what you put into each unit back, that you could then reinvest into your other estates.
There's also pre-construction as well, where they get the money beforehand.
Yeah, that can happen too, especially if you're going to sell to a fund or something.
Yeah.
Although that's kind of been outlawed now, effectively, with the high stamp duty on that kind of activity. But yeah, like if people put in deposits and that kind of stuff, that will give some finance. But the point is, from after you start building your first estate, then you can start reusing that cash into your
Yeah.
subsequent ones. The challenge with the people who build apartments is that when you build an apartment block, you don't sell it. You don't get like 400,000 in per unit. What you're getting in is just the monthly rent,
Hmm.
which could be just like €2,000, and then you get to every month you're getting 222 on each unit. But that presents a much greater financing challenge. And even if there's big international money behind those apartment blocks, though that international money is getting hit by higher interest rates in global markets. So that's just almost to explain why apartments have become a lot less attractive now. But it's also the rent caps. So because we're capped at 2%, or whatever inflation is, if that's lower, if that's 1%, that'll be your annual cap in rent. A lot of the big developers who were building those kind of apartment blocks around Dublin and other cities are now beginning to say, look, this just isn't as worthwhile for us as it once was.
Hmm. Which again, I think if we think about how we're planning and developing, our capital city, I'm an advocate for high quality, good high density living and apartments in these major cities. And again, I think to your point, David, this, yes, I think the macroeconomics affect it too, but it's also policy decisions as well, locally on the ground that actually, are resulting in this downward trend in apartment living, no longer really being, when a developer is making a choice of what type of housing do they want to have in their portfolio mix, we're seeing apartments declining significantly.
Yeah, and like developers are going to now look to ways to be more efficient in how they build
Mm-hmm.
them. I mean, there was already claims of, the average size of apartments notching lower. Actually, our minimum sizes are pretty decent, but what developers do with those minimum sizes is kind of up to them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I've heard of one developer that's now looking at trying to develop, instead of 3-bed apartments, develop 4-bed. So if you develop units with more 4 beds, and it's a bunch of four friends that live
4 bed
together.
apartments.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
If you can get four friends who share the place, that becomes more cost effective for the
Sure.
developer, because you'll get four working professionals who'll pay that money in.
That makes me think of course, the sitcom Friends.
Oh yeah,
For those who are old enough, like us, David, to have watched it before. But people always joke that, of course, the concept was you had a couple of friends,
yeah.
male and female, living on either side in New York. And everyone always questioned how the hell were they able to afford such a huge, beautiful apartment right in the middle of Manhattan. I think this might be a bit different to what the developer is looking to propose.
Yeah, and I can't remember if their apartments were 2 beds or 3 beds, but if you had two opposite each other, they might as well have been living four under the same roof anyway, because they
Yeah,
were always in and out of each other's place. So it does.
and they were
I can see.
huge.
Yeah, and these look, these wouldn't be huge, but they'd have decent living. Like if you were
Yeah,
to build for four people, you'd have to give a decent enough living area so
yeah.
that everyone has a bit of breathing space and their own bedrooms. But that would still be quite cost effective for the developer. Now,
Hmm.
ultimately, though, I'm conscious that anyone listening to this will be like, but David, people ultimately want to be able to go on and buy their own place. That's where there is some really interesting kind of green shoots in the data. This is you alluded to this, Dale, the BPFI approvals and drawdowns
Yeah.
data.
Hmm.
Yeah. I'll go through that, because that's where there's some really quite positive trends. So just to take the step back, like if you're building new homes, okay, great, that is very much needed. But what actually can also really move the housing market in favor of young people is if existing homes can be more easily purchased by first-time buyers. And there's two data points here. One is drawdowns, right? So that's people who are approved, but then they actually go to actually draw down the mortgage, and it means they're going ahead with it. They're going to pay the, the for the house with that drawdown mortgage. First time buyers, in Q4 of last year gone by, there was 8,000. drawdowns, and that compared to the Q4 in 23, which was 7,003, just under 300. So that's an 11% increase year on year. So there's more first-time buyers who are continuing to draw down mortgages. But if you look at the approvals, so approvals give you a sense of where things will go in the next couple of months. Why is that important? People get approved, they may not then go ahead with the mortgage, but
circumstances can change as well, right?
Circumstances change, but if you do get approved, it is there's a fair majority of the people who get approved ultimately are, look, they've got the income, they've got the deposit together, they are very much looking to do this. That number is up 26% year on year.
Huge.
Yeah, that's really, really encouraging. And when you look at like the million and billion euro value, that's up even more. But that's because, look, house prices are a little higher now, so that's going to explain part of that. But the actual number, if you could picture, a big queue of young people all looking to get their first homes, there's more people being cleared through that queue as we got through 24 versus 23. And that is something that's very, very welcome to see.
Yeah. So again, I think David, like the piece around this being a mixed message is there. Certainly, like the financing of homes seems to be tracking in the right direction. I know we've always talked on this podcast about affordability, how people can get their mortgage, saving up for the deposit, et cetera. But I mean, the proof is in the numbers, and to your point, that high increase of both approvals and drawdowns, especially in most recent years, it's effectively over doubled since COVID in 2020. So I think there's been a big increase. But in terms of then the mix of homes and the actual state of the construction sector itself, and being able to keep this pace and demand up is going to be a real challenge for policymakers and the next government as well to keep that pace. So certainly I hope that those who are in charge, now that we're past the election, that they keep the pace up on this really important, not just economic issue, but social issue as well.
Yeah. And if you want to raise some money towards the housing problem, you could always slap on a tariff on Canada.
Yeah, speaking nicely done, because again, I said, David, it's Friday afternoon here, and President Trump is expected to go into the Oval Office later on today. I believe 3 p.m. Eastern. He has given a signal out to the White House press pool that he will be signing some executive orders that he's been adding to that pile over the past week, and with that is tariffs. And so we wanted to talk today about, this is a really different thing that I think the world will have to contend with over the next couple of years. I think the first presidency of President Trump, we saw him put tariffs on steel and China and aluminium or aluminum, depending on how you pronounce it, in North America.
You spent too much time.
Nearly
there,
said it. I nearly said aluminum, but
the Canadians say that as well, don't they?
They do. It's
okay.
Anyway, so but we're now in the context. I mean, I feel this, David, that the second Trump presidency, very fast, very active, very aggressive. I mean, as I said, like it's been over a week now, nearly 2 weeks, and so much has happened. But with that is a major policy decision by the Trump presidency to put tariffs on nearest neighbours, Canada and Mexico, who of course are in a free trade agreement with the USMCA. President Trump's nominee to lead the Commerce Department, Howard Lutnick, he during his confirmation hearing during the week, he said that the belief that tariffs cause inflation is a total nonsense. And he believes that if you look at two top countries with tariffs, both India and China, they have the most tariffs, but they don't have high inflation. And while he conceded that certain products' prices may go up, arguing that this leads to broad-based inflation across countries, he strongly believes that it is a nonsense. He also believes, just to give a bit more insight into where this tariff policy might go, is that he prefers to have tariffs across the board on a country-by-country basis rather than having particular sectors or products, in the belief that if you pick one product, your opponent will pick the other, and it'll be a back and forth, and in the end, let's say farmers, for example, don't win. So it is a huge shift in US economic policy and foreign policy. And we're about to see, David, unless things change in the next day or so, a huge tariff being slapped on the US's nearest neighbour.
Yeah. His point about, the likes of India have tariffs and they're not doing too bad with inflation. Well, I mean, what do these countries import that make their lives a lot cheaper? I mean, what the US imports, what Western developed countries import, is cheaper goods from those kinds of countries, thus allowing them to have much cheaper availability of goods. It doesn't really work in the opposite direction. I'm a little alarmed, actually, to hear a comment like that from him. Maybe there are examples in the past of where Western countries had applied tariffs and that it wasn't inflationary. And if you could cite those, that'd be great. And maybe he did. But this is where the wheels could really fall off the Trump administration, is if they impose tariffs on those poorer countries and suddenly you can't get a cheap, I don't know, toy for your kids for Christmas, and you got to go buy something that's American made and it's twice the price. That's where the cost for everybody goes up, or at least in the US it does. So, I thought the bigger argument that tariffs weren't inflationary, that maybe Lutnick has said this, is that, well, you impose a tariff and then you don't pay, you effectively don't pay it. Nobody pays the tariff because people just build something in the US, but that still is inflationary. So,
but it also takes time, right? I mean, if you one example that has been cited has been the automotive sector, a very intertwined sector between the US and Canada. To change production lines in the automotive industry will take time, will take years to do that, and therefore, if you do apply this 25% tariff tomorrow, that's going to straight away increase the price of cars.
Yeah. There's very little
in
way
the
for
end. In the end, you can certainly shift production onshore. It's all about onshoring this stuff. Onshoring manufacturing is one thing that he says, but the reality is, with certain supply chains, it just, if you're manufacturing these complex products, it takes time.
Yeah. Like, I think Trump may find that he is a more inflationary president than Biden was, and that come the end of his presidency, we will have higher prices, we will have higher yields on government bonds, because the US runs a pretty wide budget deficit, and because he's known running businesses that he likes to raise debt and that kind of stuff, that's not so great. But he may also find that he ends his presidency with record high economic activity and record high jobs. And that's where Trump is kind of making his play too. He wants to be a jobs for America president. He's talking about the golden age. And you can have those things, but also have the side effects, which could be high inflation and high rates. The problem with that, though, is you also would then have lower stock market valuations. And I'm not sure some of the big supporters of Trump will be very happy about that. But if all these things develop slowly over the 4 years, that the stock market is just a bit flat, and but companies are still profitable, and there's enough reasons to be happy that you don't notice the bad things, then he may well leave a very popular president.
Yeah, and I think it's also from the perspective of, do they have the firepower to withstand this type of shift, right? And I mean, we've seen the stock market; it's at record levels. It's grown so significantly. So do they have the ability to go flat for a couple of years? Maybe. I think there's that argument. I think one other point that Howard looked. I think that there's two more things. One is what Howard Lutnick said was, it's this piece around disrespecting the US, where US farmers do not have the ability to sell their product into the EU, while we can do it in the reverse. I think that's one element. So market access, same with cars. He made the point of we can't sell a Ford or a Chevy into the EU quite easily, but Europe is very easily able to sell BMWs and Mercedes and other luxury vehicles into a US market with ease. So interesting point. But then there's the other point, which is, what is the actual intent here? And we saw the language and the tone and the heat really rise on should Canada be a 51st state, and the line between both countries is not real. It doesn't have substance, and effectively Canada is being subsidized by the US. And is there a wider intent here of, is he actually being serious about bringing Canada into the Union?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out with Canada and Mexico what does he really want? Because
there's mixed messages here, right?
Yeah, he signed a NAFTA deal during his first presidency.
USMCA, please.
USMCA. Yes, It sounds like YMCA. We say all those letters together. Yeah. But the idea being, okay, he got the deal done then. Why does he need to revisit it now? Why does he want that? I mean, with someone like, let's say China, he's trying to cause a decoupling from supply chains of a country that he doesn't agree politically with, and doesn't see the same outlook with direction of your country as the US does, democracy versus autocracy, or whatever you want to call it. It's different when you're dealing with two democracies that are right in your doorstep and you have really decent historic links. And maybe it's stuff on the cartels, right? So if he poses a tariff on Mexico, and then he gets agreement from the Mexicans to be able to go in to northern Mexico and root out the cartels and stop drugs coming over, that's a little more understandable. But I still don't get it with Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's he seems to have turned quite sour on it. And I watched him the week before he assumed the presidency. He did a 90-minute press conference, and it was mostly on foreign policy. And I mean, if you listen to it, it's actually quite concerning. He was dead serious that he was going to use economic force to force Canada into joining as a state, and that he was just sick and tired of what he said subsidizing Canada, that we do not need them to build our cars, we do not need them for our agriculture. So that's one thing that was concerning. We saw Panama as well. He was more than happy to. He said, "I would not rule out military force to take back Panama." Denmark, he said that he would put penal tariffs on them to force them into giving up Greenland. And this whole, he definitely the word which has been quite prominent in his language of late has been expansion of territory. So, one half of people, I think, take him at, oh, he's joking, he doesn't mean it, there's an ulterior motive to what he's trying to do. But the other side is actually one that I'm starting to really side with, is that actually I think there is intent behind what he's saying. And, it is very concerning because, the likes of Canada does not have the... I used economic firewall earlier on, does not have that economic firewall. It has a very weak currency right now. The economy is not in a great position. And probably is at the mercy of a rogue US supposed ally who can turn on them like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's more trade. I think maybe I said this on a prior episode. There's more trade from the Canadian provinces down to the states than there is from the provinces to each other.
Yeah, but
Which goes to show how connected they are. I mean, geographically, everything's just like crushed along the border, and all that economic activity is so reliant on the US. So, like,
and of course,
I mean,
it's not a free market. Interprovincial trade in Canada is not free. It's not free trade. There's tariffs in between each other. So I mean, even Canada isn't a free market. I was speaking to a friend of mine recently who is from Quebec, and he put it to me like this, actually. Oftentimes you'll see Canadian cities have a lot more connectivity and connection with their southern US counterpart. So let's say Vancouver with Seattle, Ontario, and let's say with New York. That it's oftentimes that connectivity, north and south, is a lot more present than east-west.
okay,
That was interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that one before as well. I mean, you'd expect if the trade flows are very much that way as well. You need the people to be part of it as well. It's kind of like Northern Ireland, the flows of people are kind of consistent with flows of trade. I don't get the Greenland thing as well. I mean, like, yeah. So maybe just to so the this was on the front page of the Sunday Times there at the weekend. There was a treaty done back in 1917 where the US bought, I think it was the Virgin Islands. They bought them off Denmark.
US
But
Virgin Islands, yeah.
as part of that deal, America had to agree at the time that Greenland will always be Danish, always belong to Denmark. Now, I don't know how enforceable that is. Trump probably will look to just rip that up. But within that deal, the Brits came along at the time,
That's right.
who were pretty decent global power, and they said we would like to be the first dibs on Greenland if ever it is sold. So actually, Trump might have to seek approval from Britain if he wants to buy Greenland, and actually the UK might have first dibs. But what I think should happen actually is if Britain is going to bid on Greenland, Dale, I think Ireland we should bid for it too.
Greenland.
we should jointly bid, right? So if Britain is serious, we should jump on board. Why? Britain has a massive budget deficit. They would not be able to finance it. We have a surplus and we have the Apple money. So we could come in and actually help get that deal over the
Oh, I
line.
like it. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a good idea.
So Britain doesn't have a great history of kind of protecting its minority languages as well. They speak Greenlandic up there. We've got the history of the Irish language, well talked and all of that. Look, it would actually get Ireland involved more with security and defence issues that we haven't been currently. We would have a colder region to our north, so we'd actually be able to be a little more grateful about the weather that we have here in Ireland. And Dale, we can put an Irish pub in Nook.
There actually might be one already. I don't know.
There isn't. I checked.
Isn't? Oh, you checked.
No,
okay.
Yeah. Like there's bars.
Oh my god. Well, there you go. Well, then we have to. That's it settled.
Yeah. So we could do.
I like it.
I wouldn't rule it out.
Ireland becomes a great colonial power somehow. I never thought that would. That's how.
It would probably be some sort of power sharing thing. We'd probably come up and do a kind of a Northern Ireland gig on, just to make sure that everyone's happy, including the locals. I mean, like Greenland's a tough place. There's high alcoholism rates. It's a poor place.
What concerns me, David, is that you've actually put a lot of thought into this. So,
no, I
see there's a framework being developed here.
Yeah, I have my reasons for it as well.
Oh, okay, right.
I mean, in reality, Ireland's not going to go for that bid. And I think in reality as well, the US probably isn't going to buy Greenland. Now, if I was putting a bet, I'd say they wouldn't. And the reason is, if you're a US company and you want to drill in Greenland and explore for energy, or if the US military wants to do exercises and be active up in that region, the Danes already let them.
Mm-hmm.
The Danes say yes because they're a really strong ally to the US. They let America do mostly what they want in Greenland because it's so depopulated, and what do they have to lose from it? So taking over Greenland completely, don't really see the benefit from it.
Yeah, so you're using logic and reason there, David, which is
not Trump's language.
I think it's a different focus point. I think.
Yeah, but I'm not fluent in MAGA.
No, not fluent in MAGA. But speaking of which, let's flip from that and let's talk about Meta, given that
the vibe shift.
I'm going to vibe shift now. Is that a good? Is that fair?
that's MAGA talk. That's MAGA language. So
Okay. So we're going to move to meta, where what we've seen, of course, has been fact checking is changing, and we've seen lots of major US social media companies now moving to drop the fact checking process, and instead replacing it with things like community notes, which of course X has deployed quite recently as well. So Mark Zuckerberg has, of course, been very much in the media to bring this forward. And it's an interesting point. We've seen community notes, which I'll go through in a moment, and how successful that has been. But this is all on the back end of what's known as bird watching, and bird watching draws its inspiration from Wikipedia, which of course is entirely written and edited by volunteers. And like Wikipedia, a community note would depend on unpaid contributors to correct misinformation, flag whatever they can, etc., etc. And I mean, just want to pull out some stats here, which speaks about how impactful this has been. With respect to so one study, for example, on community notes shows that an analysis of 205 notes of about COVID, 98% of them were found to be accurate. So successfully tagging and flagging misinformation as and when it appears. Research also shows that notes will increase the chance that an original poster will delete their tweet by about 80%. So there are stats and data there to show that actually that community notes can be effective. I know from my own use of X that community notes can actually be they're quite prominent, display well, and this is also in the backdrop of course, if you look at fact checkers, there was always an allegation of bias, especially those on the right in the US in particular, stating that controversial views were censored by large social media companies. But the big question, of course, then comes to, you have this system of community notes as a replacement for fact checking, but it all comes down to the algorithm and what's pushed out versus what isn't. So that's the vibe shift, David. How do you feel about it?
I'm happy with this part of the vibe shift. I'm not a big fan of tariffs or kind of throwing your weight around for against your allies, but the fact checking world had gone through scandal after scandal of being more tilted towards correcting kind of right coded content. And look, if you look at media in Ireland, when surveyed, journalists are somewhere around 60-70% left wing. There's some people in the centre, and then some people who are conservative, but it's a much smaller number. And most fact checking, as you say, your 98% numbers for the community notes, but when fact checking is done, most of the time it is capturing correctly some factual errors that get made in claims or something, or articles, whatever. But it's what you choose to fact check. And the challenge with fact checking is that there has been a much greater tilt towards choosing more conservative tilted topics to fact check. And the problem then is, if you're on somewhere like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, is that when something is fact checked, it gets massively deprioritized through the algorithm. So it was a tool of censorship. And Zuckerberg acknowledged that, 99% of the time they were correctly labeling stuff as being factually inaccurate. But we don't know what the counterfactual is. Well, if they had just as many people looking out for left-leaning content that might have inaccuracies, what would the figures for that be? One of Zuck's decisions was to move the content moderation wing of Meta out of California and down to Texas, to put it more in a politically neutral place, because it's a blue city with blue cities within red states. And that's for people who will continue, despite fact checking ending and community notes coming in. There's still going to be people who'll be looking through content for kind of terrorism, child pornography, stuff that's really egregious, stuff that would really break their terms. But they still want to have some political neutrality over that stuff, even whilst allowing other content now to be kind of given free reign. Topics like immigration and kind of transgender and sexuality stuff. Some of the moderation on that stuff is going to be eased.
Mm-hmm. So I think the question, I mean, it's early days, remains to be seen. But I mean, we're definitely seeing a bit of a pushback on, I mean, we've seen diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in corporates across the world being defunded and cut back. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But I mean, my sense as well is that I think I have found the community notes to be quite an effective tool. The watch out, though, I think, is in the algorithm and what is deployed and what's pushed versus what isn't deployed and what isn't pushed. I think that remains to be seen. I think on X, for example, I think certainly for me, Elon Musk's stuff is really pushed in your face a lot.
Yeah, I muted him. I muted him months ago. I'm really sick of him.
Maybe what I need to do as well. But that is something which I think is something, you know, like what's in the algorithm with respect to that.
Yeah. So just to talk about Meta again, Facebook and Instagram, they're going to a couple of years ago. They keep changing the algorithm. Like 10 years ago, Facebook was where you went to see photos of your friends and just post from friends. Then a load of content, quote unquote, came in. Organizations, people posted clips about good basketball shots and influencers. All that kind of stuff just reigned supreme, and people hated it. And so they tried to tilt it back. But what also came along was the kind of Brexit and Trump era, and they kind of deprioritized political stuff. So the weighting in the algorithm on controversial stuff went down. So a lot of organizations, the likes of Water for Whispers News, were actually caught up in this because they are in the news world. Even though the satire, they were actually kind of hit by those changes. But Zuckerberg is now going to allow more weighting towards political content. So you will see more kind of maybe fraught debates and engaging quote unquote debates kind of coming back to those platforms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, look, I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I think the debate lives on. You know, all of this, of course, is in the context of, are these platforms, are they publishers, who is ultimately going to be responsible for what is published on those platforms? It'll be interesting to see how, in particular, the EU, if there's a significant divergence in how that is regulated compared to how the US will go down over the next couple of years, especially under the Trump presidency. So that's the thing I'll watch out to see how that goes.
Oh yay, more European regulation, huh?
More European regulation, but could be significant as well, especially if the beast is poked. Goodwill could all be gone, and a trade war may not just be restricted to goods and services, but it also could be in terms of it could also affect the way we actually use our social media as well, potentially down the line. But with that, we are out of time, David, so I think we'll leave it there. And just again, thank everyone for listening and for watching. If you did like this podcast, please like it, please share it, and please subscribe to it. We are available on all major podcasting platforms, also available on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to our channel. Until next time, thank you for listening and for watching, and take care.